What's up, friends? Welcome to Drop In. This is Dr. Awesome. I am Dr. Awesome, and this is a quick tutorial on how to shoot video using the Canon 6D Mark II. If you've shot video with a DSLR before, nothing about this tutorial should surprise you, but we're going to go ahead and burn through this information pretty quickly. So first thing you want to do is obviously attach a lens to your camera. If you look at the lens, you can see this little red dot. On the body of the camera, there is a corresponding red dot here. Line those dots up, and then turn the camera to lock into place. Once you've got the lens on the camera, let's go ahead and put a battery in. To put a battery in the camera, on the bottom here, you just open this little door, take your battery, it's got an arrow on it indicating which way is down, slide that in, and shut the door. Also on the grip, you'll have this little door right here. This is your SD slot. Go ahead and slide that open. It pops open with a spring. Take your SD card label facing the back of the camera, slide that in, and then close the door. All right, so now we have a lens, we have a battery, we have an SD card. Obviously, the next step is turning the camera on. But before we do that, I want to draw your attention to this wheel right here. So this wheel dial, if you push this button, you can turn it. And each of these different things is a different camera setting. Now, there are circumstances in which you'd use these settings, but for the most part, my rule of thumb is always set this to M, that's manual. The reason I suggest that is that it's just going to give you the most control over the camera, and it's not going to fight you on anything. So to do that, go ahead and push that button and turn the wheel so that the M right here lines up with the little white line right there. And then we're ready to turn the camera on. The switch is right here, directly below that dial. Go ahead and slide that over to on. One more thing we want to look at here. Over here, you see this switch right here. This is actually a record button, and you can see that it has two modes. Right now, this camera is set to video, which is what we want, but it could be set to photo, and you'll notice when I switch that, the screen actually goes off, because when you're doing photography, the idea is that you'll be looking through the actual lens of the camera. But because this is video, we're going to go ahead and set that to the little red video camera. Just like a traditional camcorder, or really any camera, there are a number of things that we need to deal with before we start shooting. Frame rate, shutter speed, f-stop, ISO, color balance, all of those things. But before we do any of that, I'm going to go ahead and recommend formatting your memory card. And how you do that is you hit the menu button right here, and then there's all these different options. You can see we have the camera option here, we have the playback option. This third option, the wrench, this is where you're going to find all of your actual system functions, and it is on the first page of that menu, fourth item down, format card. Go ahead and hit set, OK, and once that's done, hit the menu button to close back out to normal camera. And now, like I said, there are a number of things we want to adjust. We're going to go ahead and start with our frame rate. So the easiest way to adjust the frame rate on this camera is to hit this Q button right here. And then over here on the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see that the second option down right now says FHD 2398. That's 24 frames a second. Go ahead and select that, and then down on the bottom, you'll see these different options appear. Now, this camera has a lot of options, but really the only ones that matter are the ones that say FHD. That's full HD. There's no reason to ever shoot below that. There's just really not. So within FHD, you can see that we have a number of options. We have 5994, that's going to be 60 frames a second. We've got 2997, that's 30 frames a second. And then 2398, that's 24 frames a second. It's important to remember that depending on what you're doing, different frame rates are going to produce different looks. 24 frames a second is the standard for film and video production. 30 frames a second is the sort of broadcast standard for news and television. And then 60 frames a second is going to be more for fluid motion and really sort of the beginning of capturing slow motion. For the purposes of this tutorial, I'm going to go ahead and set this camera to 30 frames a second, so FHD 2997. Once your frame rate is set, we're going to go ahead and talk about shutter speed. Shutter speed is one of the primary methods of controlling light coming into your camera, and it is tied to frame rate, which is why we set that first. Adjusting the shutter speed on this camera is done by this wheel right here. As I turn this wheel, what you'll see on the top screen here is there's a number right there that is going up or down depending on what this wheel is doing. Now, that number represents the fractions of a second the shutter is open, allowing light to come in and expose the image, or in this case, series of images, right? Video. The longer your shutter is open, so the smaller that number looks, this is fractions of a second, the longer the shutter is open, the smaller that number, the more light's coming in. The higher that number, the smaller the amount of time the shutter is open, the less light's coming in. If we flip this upside down here where you can see the screen, you can see that that shutter speed also displays on the bottom of the camera here. And as the number gets higher, the viewfinder gets darker, and as the number gets smaller, the viewfinder gets brighter. Again, those are fractions of a second, so 30 is actually 1/30th, 100 is actually 1/100th, right? The reason I said that shutter speed is sort of tied to frame rate is because shutter speed does something else beyond lighting. It is also how we control the motion blur of our camera. The slower your shutter speed, the more motion blur you're going to have. The higher your shutter speed, the less motion blur you're going to have. To achieve that true to life, usually what we wind up doing is following what's called the double shutter rule. And what that means is your shutter speed is double that of your frame rate. So for a 24 frames a second shoot, you would want to have your shutter speed be somewhere in the neighborhood of 1/48th or 1/50th of a second. Most DSLRs don't give you 1/48th, but they do give you 1/50th. For 30 frames a second, which is what I'm shooting in, we want to go ahead and set that shutter speed to 1/60th of a second. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And now we're ready to move on to the next step, which in this case is going to be f-stop. Now, f-stop is another method of lighting control for cameras. Basically, it's how wide the aperture of the lens is. The higher your f-stop, the smaller that aperture, the less light's coming in. The lower your f-stop, the wider that aperture, the more light's coming in. To adjust that, you'll take this wheel here and turn it to your right to make that number higher. To go to a higher f-stop, turn it to your left to get a lower f-stop. Now, along with light, your f-stop also has a dual function as well. F-stop controls not only light, but depth of field. Now remember, depth of field is the distance between the closest and farthest things in a given shot that could be considered to be in focus. The higher your f-stop, the less light's coming into the camera, the longer that depth of field is going to become. The smaller your f-stop, the more open that aperture, the shallower that depth of field becomes. So if you're looking for that cinematic look, typically what we recommend is trying to keep that f-stop as low as possible. Now, shooting outside in bright light and things like that, you can't always do that, but that's the general rule, right? Once we've got our f-stop set, the next thing we want to talk about is there is one more lighting thing, and that is ISO. Now, some people call this ISO. I don't, because while these values are set by the International Organization of Standardization, that would be iOS, and so I just refuse. But to adjust your ISO, what you'll do is you see here there's a button that says ISO. You see this meter appear on the screen. Once you've hit that button, turning it up makes the camera more sensitive to light. Turning it down makes the camera less sensitive to light. So this is really sort of akin to gain on a traditional camcorder. Light gain, though, I have to caution you, turning this up too high will produce a lot of grain in your footage. So I recommend never really turning it above like 1600 on this camera. So I'm going to go ahead and set this camera to, we're going to go, for the settings in here, we're going to go about 400, just looking at this chart here. And now we're done with light, at least for the time being. Next thing we want to look at is going to be our white balance. As with any camera, white balance is how the camera is going to define colors. It is always the best choice to manually white balance your camera, but with the 6D, like a lot of DSLRs, manually setting the white balance is kind of a super pain in the butt. I'm actually going to do a whole video dedicated to manually white balancing Canon DSLR cameras. For the purposes of this tutorial, I'm going to show you sort of the shortcut way to get a usable white balance, if not the best. And how you'll do that is, again, we hit our Q button, and then over here on the right side of the screen, The second icon, right now this is set to daylight, but if we touch that, you can see there's a lot of different options down here. We've got daylight, shade, cloudy, tungsten, white fluorescent. So because I'm in here, what I'm going to do is set this to tungsten, because that's going to be the closest white balance to our lights in the studio here, and hit OK. And actually, I can turn my ISO down a little bit. So I'm going to do that. There we go. Once your white balance is set, there is another color thing we need to consider, and that's going to be looking at your picture profile. So to set your picture profile, again, easiest way to do it, hit the Q button. It's actually the icon directly below the white balance. Touch that. You can see there's a lot of options here as well. We've got fine detail, landscape, portrait, standard, all of those things. For me, I tend to recommend setting the camera to neutral. The reason I set the camera to neutral is it's going to give you the most room to play with contrast and colors in post-production. If you're not going to do a lot of color correcting in post, you could set it to standard. But for me, I like to color grade in post, so I tend to make that as easy for me as possible. I shoot with my cameras on neutral or flat if there's a flat option. The 60 doesn't have that, but if it was there, it's what I'd use. Once we've got all of our visual stuff sort of set, before we start recording, we do want to talk about sound. So the 60 Mark II, like a lot of DSLRs, is capable of recording audio on its own, but it's not going to be good audio. You're always going to want to use some kind of secondary microphone. You can use a shotgun, you can use a lav, just whatever it is. Make sure you've got some other recording option other than just trying to go with the camera mic, because it won't make you happy. So in this instance, just for ease of sort of showing, I've got this little shotgun mic here. I'm actually going to mount it backwards for a second. Normally you would have this facing forward. I'm going to mount it backwards just for the ease of checking the audio levels here in a second. Once this is on here, you'll see on this side of the camera here, we have this little port that opens up, and that's your mic jack. Just plugs in right there like that. Now, a lot of times you could leave this set on audio, but if you really want to try and get it the best quality possible, what you're going to do is, once again, hit our Q button, and then over here on the left-hand side, you'll see the little microphone icon. If you hit that, you can see the audio recording level. And down here on the bottom, you have these different, you have the left and right arrows, and what you want to do is you want to try and make sure you're hitting in that sort of -12 range. You could adjust this up or down as you needed to get there. And so for me, with this microphone right here, that's about right. Go ahead and hit set, and that will set it. Now we're really sort of ready to focus up and start recording. With traditional camcorders, one of the things we talk about doing when it comes to focusing is we talk about zooming all the way in and focusing on the eyes and then zooming back out. With DSLRs, I don't really recommend that because, especially with some of the cheaper lenses that you can get, you're going to get what's called focus compression, which means that something in focus at a certain zoom won't be in focus at a different zoom. So when it comes to focusing a DSLR, what you're going to want to do is actually see this little magnifying glass here. Go ahead and hit that, and that'll zoom you in. And then using the outer ring of your camera, assuming it's set to manual focus, you can focus that up. Now, I'm actually too close. There we go. So you can kind of see that we can focus that up. One cool thing about Canon cameras is they do have what's called dual pixel autofocus, which I don't typically recommend using autofocus if you're doing interviews or things like that, or B-roll. But if you're doing the whole vlog thing, or you're following somebody down a hallway or something like that, you can use autofocus, and that would be acceptable. And how you turn that on is you have this little knob right here, or switch rather, and you move that from MF to AF, and then you can have the camera focus. It will also do follow focus, where you touch the screen like I just did there, and you can see the little icon appear and move across the screen. If you need to zoom, it's still something you can do. You would simply use this ring right here. Once you've got your zoom set, you've got your focus set, you're going to want to go ahead and record, which like I said before, this button right here is your record button. You hit the button to start. You'll notice a record icon on the screen, and this little red light flashes here. To stop, you just hit the button again. If you wanted to play back your footage, you would actually hit this button right here, the little play button, little play icon, touch screen, and you're good to go. That really is pretty much the basic rundown of the settings you need to sort of keep in mind when you're shooting with this camera. Obviously, there's a lot that actually goes into getting the right shot. Different settings at different times are going to be more useful. There may be times where you break that double shutter rule. There may be times where you intentionally have a shallow or long depth of field, depending on what you're doing. It really just, it comes down to what you're trying to do. And so the blanket statement that I give with everything, obviously the first time you use this, you're not going to be an expert at it. It takes practice, it takes time. Check one out, go ahead and start seeing what it can do and what you can do with it. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me at WrightCI, that's WRIGHTCI, at longwood.edu. If you're on campus, you're welcome to come by my office and talk to me. We'll try and do the best we can to make sure that you get what you need. That being said, that's all I've got. So, keep shooting, friends.